Imagine a world where being called a terrorist was, actually a compliment.
Right, which sounds completely absurd to us today.
I mean, a literal badge of honor that you would just wear proudly in public. It feels like a total oxymoron sitting here right now.
It really does. But history is just full of these bizarre sort of upside-down flips.
Yeah, where a concept begins as one thing and then through decades of political friction and new tech, it just morphs into its exact opposite.
And the evolution of that specific word is actually one of the most fascinating paradoxes in political science, I think.
Because you are so conditioned, right, to hear it and immediately picture chaos or subversion. You picture hidden bombs and anti-state violence.
Exactly. But the roots of the concept, like the very invention of the term, were fundamentally tied to order. It was about civic virtue and the absolute control of the state over its people.
And tracing that chaotic evolution is exactly what we're going to do today on this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a really wild journey.
If you've been following the news or, studying history, or if you're just trying to make sense of the modern geopolitical landscape, you've probably noticed that the definition of this word just constantly shifts.
It's always a moving target.
Right. So we are taking the massive stack of research you sent us, academic texts, sociological studies, historical analyses, and we are going to walk through this chronologically.
We're tailoring this deep dive for you, the listener, to really help you master these historical nuances without feeling, totally overwhelmed by the dates and names.
Because the goal isn't just to memorize dates. We want to understand the why. Why did tactics change? Why do definitions remain such a fierce debate?
And what does this all mean for global security today, right? We're tracing the shifting definition from its origins as a righteous tool of the government during the French Revolution all the way to modern digital propaganda.
Right, up to hybrid warfare and decentralized lone wolves. But right at the top, since you are diving into this complex subject with us, I do need to make a really critical disclaimer here.
Yeah, this is important to lay out early.
We are unpacking some highly charged historical events and deeply complex academic texts today. We are going to be discussing controversial figures and brutal political movements.
Spanning centuries, yeah, and including modern conflicts, obviously.
Exactly. So our goal here is strictly to explore the historical facts and the academic definitions provided in the source material. We are not taking sides.
No, absolutely not. We're impartially reporting on the content provided.
Right. We are not endorsing any of the ideologies or political actions we discuss. And we certainly aren't judging the politics of these conflicts.
We just want to convey the ideas contained in the original source material to understand the mechanics of how this concept evolved.
Perfect. So let's plunge right into the deep end. Take me back to the late 18th century, to the French Revolution.
Okay, let's go to 1793.
Because I am looking at these sources and I am really struggling to reconcile the modern imagery of terrorism with this idea of a government enforcing virtue.
It's a huge mental leap, I know.
What exactly was happening in France that made this connection even possible?
Well, to really grasp this, you have to picture the sheer existential panic of France in 1793.
Okay.
The revolution of 1789 had just torn down the old monarchical system, which was, a centuries-old structure of feudalism and absolute royal authority.
Right, they threw out the king.
Exactly. But by 1793, the newly established revolutionary state, the First French Republic, it was basically fighting for its very survival.
It was essentially total anarchy, right?
Absolute anarchy. Externally, the borders of France were being invaded by the armies of neighboring monarchies like Prussia and Austria.
Because those kings were terrified, the democratic revolution would spill over into their own kingdoms.
Exactly that. They wanted to crush it. And internally, there were these massive counter-revolutionary uprisings.
Like in the Vendée region, the sources mentioned.
Yeah, specifically in the Vendée, where royalist sympathizers were actively fighting a civil war to restore the king.
So the new government is surrounded by hostile empires and burning from the inside out at the same time.
Right. They are looking at the total collapse of their brand new republic.
Okay, that paints a pretty desperate picture.
It was. So the leaders of the revolution, specifically that radical faction known as the Jacobins, they realized that traditional law and order were just totally insufficient.
They needed to hold the country together by force.
They needed a way to establish total compliance, and they needed it immediately. So the method they engineered was a formalized regime of terror.
Or, as they officially called it, La Terreur.
Exactly.
But wait, this wasn't a group of rebels hiding in the shadows trying to topple the government. This was the actual government.
That is the defining characteristic of this entire era. The Reign of Terror which lasted roughly from September 1793 to July 1794, was an instrument of the state itself.
Wow.
It was an organized, deliberate, highly bureaucratic tool used by the new regime to solidify power.
To systematically intimidate anyone who might oppose the revolution.
Yes. They passed actual laws, like the law of suspects, which essentially made it a capital crime to even vaguely express support for the old regime.
Or to just not be enthusiastic enough about the new one.
Yeah, exactly. You could be killed for lacking enthusiasm.
And the architect of all this was Maximilien Robespierre. Looking at his writings and the source material, the mental gymnastics he uses to justify this are just staggering.
Oh, they really are. He explicitly links the terror to virtue.
Right. There's a specific quote from a speech he gave in 1794 that we really need to break down. Robespierre stated, "Terror without virtue is fatal. Virtue without terror is powerless."
Such a famous line.
And then he goes on to say, "Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue."
It is a chillingly logical argument, if you accept his premise.
Which is what, exactly?
Well, Robespierre genuinely believed that the revolution was the highest expression of human morality. He thought overthrowing a tyrannical monarchy to establish equality was a fundamentally virtuous act.
Sure, okay.
But he also recognized that this fragile new virtue was under attack from all sides. Therefore, to protect the virtue of the Republic, the state had an absolute moral obligation to ruthlessly destroy its enemies.
Oh, I see. It essentially functions like an aggressive medical treatment, like an immune system.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Like if the Republic is the body and the counter-revolutionaries are a deadly infection, Robespierre is arguing that the government basically has to induce a violent fever.
Right.
The state attacks its own body, raising the temperature to a lethal degree just to burn out the disease.
Yeah.
The fever is brutal and destructive, but it's virtuous because it's trying to save the patient.
Yeah. That immune system parallel perfectly captures the biological necessity they felt. The violence wasn't seen as a necessary evil.
It was a purifying force.
Exactly. And the mechanism they used to deliver this inflexible justice was the guillotine.
Right, in the public square.
It was public, it was mechanical, and it was incredibly efficient. It was designed to be this highly visible spectacle of state power.
To remind every single citizen that the Republic was entirely in control.
Exactly.
But obviously, a government operating at a fever pitch of paranoia like that can't sustain itself.
Now it always burns out.
Robespierre ends up being consumed by his own machine. He gets sent to the guillotine himself in 1794, and that brings the reign of terror to an end.
Right. But the concept of the state using terror to maintain order, that didn't die with him at all.
No. The sources jump forward to the 20th century to show how this idea came back.
Yeah, we see a massive resurgence of state-led terror following the First World War.
Because the global map was completely shattered.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, they all collapsed.
And in that chaotic vacuum left behind, totalitarian regimes took root.
Right. We see the rise of fascism under Mussolini in Italy, Nazism under Hitler in Germany, and Stalinism in the Soviet Union.
And just like the Jacobins, these regimes used terror to build their new societies. But the underlying philosophy feels fundamentally different than Robespierre's twisted idea of democratic virtue.
It is a crucial evolution because Robespierre utilized terror as an emergency measure to save a fragile republic.
Right, a temporary fever.
But the totalitarian dictators of the 20th century, they institutionalized terror as a permanent mechanism of absolute control.
Wow. Okay.
They wielded massive bureaucratic and military machines like the Gestapo in Germany or the NKVD in the Soviet Union.
And not just to eliminate active dissent, but to paralyze the population with this constant invisible fear.
Exactly. It wasn't the public spectacle of the guillotine in the town square anymore. It was the midnight knock on the door.
The secret police, the disappearances.
Yeah, they were using state terror from the top down to secure absolute power and ensure total, unquestioning compliance from everyone.
Okay, so we have this really clear origin point. For over a century, terror is a top-down mechanism.
Right.
It is the overwhelming power of the state crushing the individual. But today, the definition is completely inverted for us.
It's the exact opposite now.
Yeah, we view terrorism as a bottom-up mechanism.
Yeah.
It's the underdog, the non-state actor, striking at the powerful state. How exactly did that massive conceptual pivot happen?
Well, that pivot requires us to rewind slightly and look at the turbulent sociological shifts of the 19th century.
Okay, let's go back.
This was an era defined by massive upheaval. You had the Industrial Revolution rapidly changing how people lived and worked.
Creating massive wealth disparity and terrible working conditions in cities.
Right. You had the rise of modern capitalism. And out of this friction, you saw the birth of powerful universalist ideologies.
Specifically anarchism and nationalism, according to the text.
Exactly.
And these groups, the anarchists, the extreme nationalists, they are looking at the massive centralized power of these 19th century empires and realizing they just can't fight them conventionally.
Right. You can't line up an army of factory workers against the British Empire or the Russian Tsar.
It would be a slaughter.
The power asymmetry was just absolute. So in this incredibly volatile context, terrorism becomes a sub-state tool.
It becomes the weapon of the disenfranchised group trying to weaken or overthrow an established state.
Exactly. And the intellectual pioneer of this shift was an Italian Republican and extremist named Carlo Pisacane.
Pisacane is such a fascinating figure in these notes. He introduces a concept that essentially writes the entire blueprint for modern subversion.
Right, the concept of propaganda by the deed.
Yes, propaganda by the deed. For the students listening, let's simplify this because I think it's one of the most vital concepts to grasp if you want to understand the psychological mechanics of terrorism.
Absolutely. Up until this point, political dissidents primarily relied on the written and spoken word, right?
They published pamphlets, wrote philosophical manifestos.
They gave fiery speeches in secret assemblies. But Pisacane looked at this and argued it was entirely backwards.
He argued that ideas don't generate actions. Actions generate ideas. I want to linger on this because it's a profound psychological insight.
It really is.
He believed that you couldn't just educate the illiterate, exhausted masses into starting a revolution by handing them a dense philosophical essay.
No, you had to physically jolt them awake.
Violence, in his view, wasn't just about eliminating a specific political enemy. It was a pedagogical tool.
It was violent education.
Right. The action itself, the violent deed, was the message. A pamphlet can be confiscated by the police. A speech can be silenced, but a bomb exploding in a symbol of state power is undeniable.
It forces the public to pay attention. The violence is a bloody billboard designed to shatter the illusion of the state's invincibility.
So who was the first to actually use this?
The first group to truly operationalize Pisacane's theory was a radical Russian organization called Narodnaya Volya.
Which translates to people's will.
Yes. They were a small, highly secretive group founded in 1878 with a singular, seemingly impossible goal.
To confront the absolute power of the Tsarist regime in Russia.
Right. And their strategy was deeply focused. They weren't trying to start a mass civil war in the streets.
They were targeting the absolute apex of the system.
They recognized that the Tsar, Alexander II, was the linchpin of the entire autocratic system.
So if they could demonstrate that the Tsar was not an untouchable, divinely appointed god king, but a mortal man who could bleed.
They believed that psychological shockwave would awaken the Russian peasantry and actually trigger a revolution.
The sources detail their attempts, and it is a relentless campaign. They spent years trying to get to it.
They were incredibly persistent.
They literally tunneled under railway tracks to mine the Tsar's personal train. They infiltrated the Winter Palace and detonated a massive explosive in the dining room, missing him by mere minutes.
It was a sustained campaign of intense psychological pressure, and eventually they succeed.
In 1881, right?
Yes, in 1881, after numerous failed attempts, operatives of Narodnaya Volya intercepted the Tsar's heavily guarded carriage in St. Petersburg and threw explosive devices directly at it.
Assassinating Alexander II.
Exactly.
But the peasant revolution they hoped for, that didn't happen. The state's reaction was swift and devastating.
The Tsarist state retaliated with overwhelming force. They unleashed their secret police, the Okhrana.
And by 1883, the leaders of Narodnaya Volya had been hunted down, arrested, and publicly executed.
So their immediate political goal, a peasant uprising, failed completely.
But they proved a terrifying concept to the rest of the world.
Yes, they proved that a tiny, dedicated cell of individuals with limited resources could strike at the very heart of a massive empire.
They successfully proved the concept of the deed. But their tactics were still highly localized, right? They were Russians attacking the Russian head of state inside Russia.
Right, very contained geographically.
But as we continue through the 19th century, the sources introduced the Irish Republican groups. And this is where the strategy evolves from a local assassination plot to a transnational terror network.
The Irish evolution represents a massive leap in tactical sophistication.
So that's the stage for us there.
Well, following the devastating famine and massive immigration of the mid-19th century, large populations of Irish immigrants settled in the United States.
And they naturally harbored deep grievances against British colonial rule back in Ireland,
Exactly. Out of this diaspora, secret organizations formed, such as the Fenian Brotherhood in the U.S.
which funded and supported a sister organization in Ireland called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB.
But the real paradigm shift comes with a splinter group called Clan na Gael.
And specifically its leader, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Looking at his history here, he essentially lays the blueprint for modern global terror networks.
He really does. O'Donovan Rossa was a hardened revolutionary. He had been imprisoned and subjected to brutal treatment by the British before being exiled to the United States.
So operating from the safety of New York, he realized that staging another traditional localized armed uprising in Ireland was just futile.
Yeah, the British military would easily crush it, just like before. So in 1875, he published a manifesto calling for the creation of what he termed skirmishers.
And a skirmisher in this context isn't an infantryman on a battlefield. He is conceptualizing a guerrilla fighter operating far behind enemy lines.
Right. He argued that these skirmishers shouldn't just attack in Ireland. He wanted volunteers traveling by land and sea to strike targets in mainland England.
And even as far away as the British colonies in India.
He was advocating for a borderless campaign of psychological warfare. This is a massive conceptual leap.
He is taking the localized propaganda by the deed of the Russian anarchists and applying it globally against the entire infrastructure of the British Empire.
Exactly. And he was able to propose this global strategy because the technological landscape was shifting rapidly underneath them.
Yeah, the 19th century wasn't just producing new political ideologies, it was producing cutting-edge technology that perfectly suited covert violence.
We really cannot overstate how pivotal technological advancements were in shaping early terrorist tactics. You have two massive innovations occurring almost simultaneously.
What's the first one?
In 1867, Alfred Nobel invents dynamite. Prior to dynamite, extremists relied on highly unstable explosives like nitroglycerin or bulky black powder.
Which was dangerous to transport.
Right. Dynamite was relatively stable, incredibly destructive, and crucially easily concealable.
And the second innovation is the modern rotary printing press, perfected around 1881.
Yes. So suddenly, a small sub-state group has access to easily hidden, highly destructive weaponry to commit the deed.
And the mass media technology to print thousands of pamphlets overnight to spread the propaganda explaining the deed to the public.
It's the perfect storm for this kind of warfare.
But the sources highlight one specific technological innovation used by the Irish groups that completely changed the nature of the threat. It wasn't just the dynamite, it was the timing mechanism.
The timer was revolutionary.
In the 1880s, Irish groups began utilizing clockwork timer-based explosives. I want to unpack the tactical impact of this, because before timers, if you wanted to blow something up, you generally had to light a fuse and throw it,
Like the Russian assassins did.
which often meant you died in the blast or were immediately captured.
Exactly. The timer fundamentally altered the logistics, the psychology, and the survivability of a terror campaign. With a timer, a perpetrator could walk into a crowded London train station, leave a satchel containing dynamite and a clockwork mechanism under a bench, and calmly walk away.
By the time the explosion tore through the station, the bomber could be miles away.
Deeply hidden in the city or even boarding a ship back to America.
The psychological impact on the civilian population must have been paralyzing. The enemy is invisible now.
Completely invisible. The violence is disconnected from the perpetrator. Anyone leaving a bag could be a threat.
It induced a profound sense of vulnerability within the British public.
And between 1881 and 1885, Clan na Gael and the IRB launched what was called the Dynamite Campaign.
They systematically bombed London's train stations, the London Underground, and even targeted symbols of state power like Scotland Yard and the Tower of London.
The goal was to exhaust the British public, damage the economy, and force the government to negotiate on Irish independence.
So how on earth does a 19th century state respond to this? Because traditional state power, like marching a battalion of soldiers down the street, is completely useless against an invisible man with a clockwork bomb in a briefcase.
The British government quickly realized that their conventional military and traditional policing methods were entirely unequipped for this new paradigm.
They had to invent a new mechanism of state defense.
They did. In 1883, in direct response to the transit bombings, the British government established the Special Irish Branch within London's Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard.
And this is widely recognized by historians as the very first dedicated counterterrorism unit in history.
It was an absolute necessity. They understood that you cannot fight a clandestine, decentralized network with uniformed patrols.
So what do they do differently?
The Special Irish Branch pioneered modern counterterrorism tradecraft. They utilized plainclothes detectives. They focused on intelligence gathering rather than just responding to crimes after the fact.
They were actively infiltrating Irish immigrant communities in London, recruiting informants.
Trailing suspects, and even intercepting international communications between the US and the UK.
They were trying to map the network before the bomb went off.
Precisely.
So we leave the 19th century with the board fully set for the modern era. We have extreme ideologies, transnational networks, explosive technology, mass media, and the birth of state intelligence agencies designed specifically to hunt them.
The foundational elements are all there.
Right. As we push the timeline into the 20th century, specifically the years following World War II, the global map is being redrawn again.
The great colonial empires, the British, the French, they are crumbling.
And the definition of terrorism gets extremely messy here.
Oh, it becomes incredibly subjective. The post-WWII era is characterized by a wave of decolonization.
Across the globe, in places like Israel, Kenya, Cyprus, and perhaps most intensely, Algeria.
Right. Nationalist movements are rising up to violently eject their European colonizers. And in almost all these conflicts, terrorism becomes a primary tactic.
Let's focus deeply on Algeria, because the conflict between the French state and the Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN, in the 1950s is a masterclass in the unintended, disastrous consequences of state counterterrorism policy.
It really is a tragic case study.
The FLN begins a brutal campaign against the French colonial presence. They are bombing cafes, assassinating police officers, trying to force the French to leave. And the French state's response, it completely backfires.
It is a textbook example of how a disproportionate state response can fuel an insurgency.
What exactly did the French do?
The French government, desperate to hold on to Algeria, deployed immense military force. They sent in paratroopers to lock down the capital, Algiers.
But more importantly, the French military systematically employed extrajudicial actions.
Yes, most notably the widespread and institutionalized use of torture against suspected FLN members and sympathizers.
If we look back at the analogy of the harsh medical treatment from the French Revolution, the aggressive immune system burning out the disease, in Algeria, the treatment starts killing the patient.
Exactly. The French brutality actually serves the FLN's goals.
That is the tragic irony. The FLN, as a weaker non-state actor, actively wanted to provoke the French state into an overreaction.
They understood that if the French military abandoned the rule of law and began torturing and executing people in the streets, the French state would completely lose its moral legitimacy.
Both in the eyes of the Algerian population and on the global stage.
Right. The violence by the state proved the terrorists' core argument, that the colonial system was inherently evil and had to be destroyed.
The torture accelerated recruitment for the FLN. Every moderate Algerian who might have opposed the FLN's bombings suddenly found themselves alienated by the cruelty of the French military.
It drove them right into the arms of the insurgency.
And this dynamic, playing out not just in Algeria but across various anti-colonial struggles, gave rise to a massive global debate over semantics and legitimacy.
The 1960s and 70s are when the term freedom fighter fully enters the international lexicon.
Because the world is fractured by the Cold War. You have newly independent nations and the Soviet bloc looking at these anti-colonial groups not as criminals, but as legitimate liberation armies.
Exactly. The international community could no longer agree on what constituted terrorism.
And this debate culminated in a highly symbolic moment in 1974, when Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, was invited to speak at the United Nations General Assembly.
That speech was a watershed moment.
I am looking at the excerpts from that speech. He addresses this definitional crisis head-on. He states that the difference between a revolutionary and a terrorist lies purely in the justice of their cause.
Right.
He argues that whoever stands by a just cause and fights for the freedom and liberation of their land from invaders cannot be called a terrorist.
It was a profound challenge to the Western legal order. Arafat was essentially arguing that the end justifies the means.
If your goal is self-determination against a colonial oppressor, then violent methods, even those targeting civilians, are a tragic necessity of war, not terrorism.
And this perspective meant that a significant portion of the globe simply stopped labeling certain violent sub-state groups as terrorists.
The definition became entirely subjective, warped by Cold War politics and regional alliances.
It is the exact origin of that tired cliché. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
But the sources show that as we move into the 1980s and 1990s, the motivations driving these groups become even more tangled. We move past purely political liberation and enter the murky era of narco-terrorism.
Narco-terrorism was a new, highly complex paradigm that deeply frustrated security analysts.
Initially, in the early 1980s, the term was coined to describe the actions of Marxist-Leninist regimes, like the Soviet Union or Cuba,
Right, who were allegedly facilitating the trafficking of narcotics into the United States as a deliberate strategy to weaken and destabilize Western society.
basically using drugs as a slow-motion biological weapon.
Precisely. But the definition quickly evolved to describe something much more immediate and violent.
The tactical alliances formed between massive South American cocaine cartels and extreme left-wing guerrilla groups.
Yes, particularly in countries like Colombia and Peru.
This is where the lines completely blur for me. I'm trying to wrap my head around how this functioned on the ground. A Marxist guerrilla group, like the FARC in Colombia, is ideologically driven to overthrow the capitalist state.
Right.
A cocaine cartel is driven purely by the capitalist desire to make billions of dollars. How do those two fundamentally opposed motivations merge?
They merged out of pure tactical necessity. The guerrilla groups controlled vast swaths of remote jungle territory where the cartels needed to grow coca and build processing labs.
So, a transactional relationship formed.
The heavily armed, ideologically driven guerrillas provided security for the cartel's labs and hidden airstrips, protecting them from the government military.
And in exchange, the cartels provided the guerrillas with massive infusions of cash, allowing them to buy better weapons and recruit more fighters.
Exactly. It was a symbiotic relationship.
But the cartels didn't just buy protection. They actually adopted the tactics.
They did. When the Colombian government, pressured by the U.S., threatened to extradite cartel leaders, guys like Pablo Escobar didn't just bribe judges anymore.
They started detonating massive car bombs in Bogota. They blew up a commercial airliner.
And that is the crux of narcoterrorism. When a cartel uses extreme violence purely for profit, like murdering a rival trafficker, that is organized crime.
But when they detonate a car bomb in a city center to force the government to change its extradition laws, they're using violence to achieve a political outcome.
They have crossed the line into terrorism.
For a government trying to maintain security, this sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It really was. Because traditional law enforcement, like the DEA, is focused on burning crops and seizing bank accounts.
While traditional military counterterrorism is focused on hunting insurgents and negotiating political settlements.
Right. But when you face a hybrid entity that possesses the immense financial resources of a multinational corporation and the fanatical, violent tactics of an insurgency, both traditional approaches fail.
You burn the crops, they just bomb a police station in retaliation. You try to negotiate, but there is no political compromise to be made with a drug lord whose only goal is impunity.
It forced states to completely integrate their intelligence, law enforcement, and military strategies. The threat had mutated beyond traditional categories.
Which brings us to a really significant section of the research you provided. The academics struggled to actually define this phenomenon. Why, after 200 years of studying this, is defining terrorism still considered an unresolvable academic battleground?
Reading through these academic texts, it feels like everyone is looking at a different piece of the elephant.
A criminologist looks at terrorism and sees a massive violation of penal law. A political scientist looks at it and sees a desperate bid to alter power dynamics.
A military historian sees it as a form of irregular, asymmetric warfare. And a communications scholar sees it as a violent, media-driven propaganda campaign.
And they are all correct.
They are. Terrorism is fundamentally multidisciplinary. To understand its true nature, you have to synthesize all those perspectives simultaneously.
And because academics generally specialize in one field, forging a single, universally accepted analytical framework is just incredibly difficult.
The sources highlight two heavyweight scholars who have tried to bring order to this chaos, Bruce Hoffman and Alex Schmid.
Let's explore Hoffman's framework first, because it feels very definitive. For students listening, Hoffman argues that a true terrorist act must have several core components.
Right. It must involve the deliberate exploitation of fear, and it must have far-reaching psychological repercussions that go way beyond the immediate victims.
But the two most crucial pillars for Hoffman are that the violence must have a political finality.
Meaning there has to be a political end goal, not just a desire for profit or revenge.
And most importantly, it must be perpetrated by a subnational or non-state entity.
That last point is Hoffman's hard line in the sand. For Hoffman, if a sovereign state uses violence against civilians to induce fear, that is state-sponsored oppression or a war crime or a crime against humanity.
But it is not terrorism in the specific modern analytical sense he uses to categorize non-state extremist groups.
He believes keeping that distinction clear is vital for legal and military clarity.
But then we look at Alex Schmid, and he takes a completely different approach. Instead of dictating a rigid definition, Schmid undertook a massive empirical study in 2013.
He interviewed over 100 top global experts on terrorism and synthesized their incredibly diverse views into 12 common traits.
And looking closely at how he groups these traits, it really exposes the tension in the field.
Analyzing Schmid's consensus is vital because it reveals the incredibly complex mechanics of the act. Let's look at how these traits cluster together.
Okay, what's the first group?
The first major theme Schmid identified is the nature of the violence itself. The experts agree that it is a doctrine of violent tactics aimed at generating extreme fear and coercion.
It is conspiratorial, and it is directed primarily at civilians or non-combatants.
Furthermore, it's rarely an isolated incident. It involves a serialized campaign of violence, like a sustained series of bombings or hostage situations designed to manipulate a political process over time.
And the second major theme that emerges from Schmid's research is the deeply manipulative psychology of the targeting.
He notes that the immediate intent is to terrorize or destabilize an opponent, but the violence is always social in its repercussions.
The most chilling insight he provides is the disconnect between the victim and the target. Schmid notes that the immediate victims of a terrorist act are merely instrumental.
They are, in his exact words, the skin of a drum beaten to achieve an impact on a larger audience.
I want to dwell on that metaphor because it perfectly captures the cruelty of the act. If two armies are fighting and a soldier shoots another soldier to capture a hill, the death is a tragic necessity to achieve a physical objective.
Right, it's tactical.
But in terrorism, if a group blows up a crowded cafe, the people in the cafe aren't the objective. Their deaths are just the ink used to write a violent message.
The victims are props.
The actual target is the mind of the politician watching the aftermath on the news, or the millions of citizens who are suddenly terrified to go to a cafe. The violence is a brutal form of threat-based communication.
It is the ultimate objectification of human life. The victims are stripped of their humanity and reduced entirely to their shock value.
That communication process, using the dead to speak to the living, is the absolute core of the phenomenon.
But the third theme from Schmid's research is where we hit the massive divergence from Bruce Hoffman's theory.
Right. Schmid's consensus found that the perpetrators of this violence can be driven by a massive range of motivations: grievances, liberation, ideology, religion.
But crucially, Schmid found that perpetrators can be state actors or state-sponsored agents, like covert death squads.
So under Schmid's umbrella, the reign of terror during the French Revolution, or Stalin's purges, or a modern state secretly funding a militia to terrorize a minority population, absolutely qualifies as terrorism.
That is the core unresolved tension in the field. Does the badge of statehood legitimize terror or just change its legal classification?
To make sense of this academic split, it feels like Hoffman is focused on describing the engine of a specific vehicle. He is intensely focused on the political drive and the non-state actor pressing the gas pedal.
That's a good way to put it.
While Schmid, on the other hand, has taken the entire vehicle apart in the garage, laying out the 12 distinct mechanical parts: the fear, the communication, the instrumental victims.
And he is acknowledging that sometimes a sovereign state can slide into the driver's seat and operate those exact same mechanisms.
That conceptualization actually gets to the heart of why this matters for policy. These definitions dictate how modern governments allocate billions of dollars.
Interestingly, when Schmid asked his 100 experts what the most effective countermeasures against terrorism were, massive military force wasn't at the top of the list.
The consensus was that superior integrated intelligence, achieving international legal agreements on definitions, and aggressively limiting the spread of online propaganda were far more effective tools than conventional warfare.
Which brings us to the hinge point of modern history, September 11th, 2001.
We have traced the evolution from localized assassinations to transnational networks, but al-Qaeda fundamentally shifted the paradigm again. How did the attacks in New York and Washington alter the global calculus?
Up until the 1990s, the terror campaigns that dominated the news, like the IRA in Northern Ireland or ETA in Spain, were largely ethno-nationalists.
They were violent, but they were geographically contained and often sought specific, localized political concessions.
Al-Qaeda dramatically escalated the scale and the ambition. They introduced the era of massive high-impact transnational attacks.
Explicitly designed to inflict such catastrophic trauma that they could dictate the global media agenda and fundamentally reorder global geopolitics.
They weren't trying to force the British to leave Belfast, they were trying to collapse the Western-led global order.
We saw the escalation building, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the massive 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000.
And then 9/11, which was followed by the devastating transit bombings in Madrid in 2004 and London in 2005.
The scale of the psychological shock was unprecedented.
And the state response to that unprecedented shock fundamentally altered international law and security. Following 9/11, the United States made a massive semantic and policy decision.
The government explicitly declared a war on terror. We hear that phrase so often it loses its meaning, but analytically, declaring war on a tactic or on a non-state network is a massive shift.
It is a critical distinction. Historically, under international law, a state only declares war on another sovereign nation state.
By framing the response to al-Qaeda as a literal war, rather than a massive transnational criminal investigation, the U.S. government implicitly elevated a network of extremists to the operational status of a nation-state.
This semantic shift removed the conflict from the realm of police and intelligence agencies and placed it squarely in the realm of the military.
It provided the framework for sweeping new surveillance laws, the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, and ultimately paved the way for the 2003 invasion of Iraq and decades of military entanglement in the Middle East.
And while the geopolitics were shifting, the propaganda tactics were evolving at lightning speed, continuously adapting to new technology.
We talked about how dynamite and the printing press changed the game in the 19th century. In the late 20th century, the game changer was satellite television.
The sources point out that the horrifying 1972 attack at the Munich Olympics by the Palestinian group Black September was meticulously designed for the satellite TV era.
They knew that thousands of live television cameras were pointed at Munich. So they didn't just plant a bomb. They staged a prolonged, agonizing hostage crisis to hijack that live global feed.
Guaranteeing that hundreds of millions of people would watch their demands in real time.
It was the ultimate realization of Schmid's drum metaphor, broadcast instantly into living rooms across the planet.
But as we transition into the modern era, the post-9/11 landscape, that evolution from pamphlets to radio to live satellite television, takes its ultimate, most pervasive form in digital propaganda.
Let's talk deeply about Daesh, also known as ISIS or the Islamic State. Because if Carlo Pisacane and the 19th century anarchists were the pioneers of the physical deed, Daesh became the absolute masters of the digital deed.
They didn't rely on hijacking CNN or the BBC to broadcast their message. They bypassed the traditional media gatekeepers entirely.
They built their own self-sustaining media empire on the internet.
What is truly fascinating and deeply alarming from a sociological perspective is how Daesh treated terrorism not just as violence, but as a sophisticated postmodern communication phenomenon.
They utilized a strategy that communication scholars refer to as transmedia narratives.
I am looking at that term in the notes, transmedia narratives. I understand how a bomb physically destroys a target, but I'm struggling to see how a collection of tweets and digital magazines equates to a weapon.
Walk me through the mechanics of how they use this.
A transmedia narrative is the technique of telling a single, highly immersive, cohesive story across multiple digital platforms simultaneously.
Oh, like a massive marketing campaign.
Exactly. Daesh didn't just release a grainy video from a cave. They operated a synchronized digital ecosystem. A specific battle or ideological message would be teased on Twitter.
Then debated on encrypted forums, glorified in a beautifully designed digital magazine like Dabiq.
And then culminated in a highly produced 4K resolution video released on multiple streaming sites. All of these platforms reinforce the same carefully constructed narrative universe.
And the aesthetic they chose was incredibly deliberate. They weren't using traditional dry theological lectures. They adopted the visual language of Western pop culture.
Their propaganda videos look like Hollywood movie trailers or high-end first-person shooter video games like Call of Duty. They used slow motion, stylized editing, and dramatic soundtracks.
They recognized that they were competing for attention in a saturated digital market. They weren't just broadcasting violence, they were actively seducing their audience.
They were targeting disenfranchised, alienated, often young individuals across the globe who felt powerless in their own societies.
Daesh offered them a digital social contract. Join our virtual caliphate, and we will give you purpose, brotherhood, and a starring role in this epic, violent narrative.
It is a terrifyingly effective manipulation of human psychology.
Right.
And the research draws striking parallels between Daesh's digital manipulation and the concept of Russian hybrid warfare.
There is a specific military theory mentioned here that I need you to break down for me. The Soviet theory of reflexive control.
Reflexive control is a deeply sophisticated psychological warfare doctrine. It is the practice of systematically feeding an adversary targeted information, disinformation, and specific provocations.
With the ultimate goal of confusing the adversary's population and leadership so thoroughly that they voluntarily make decisions that are inherently self-destructive.
Give me a concrete example of how that works in practice. How do you trick an enemy into hurting themselves?
In a traditional military context, if I want your army to abandon a heavily fortified position, I don't launch a costly frontal assault. Instead, I use reflexive control.
I leak fake intelligence, suggesting I am amassing a massive force to outflank you and cut off your supply lines. I let you discover this fake information.
Panicked by the illusion of being surrounded, your commanders voluntarily order a retreat, abandoning the fortress and marching directly into the actual ambush I have waiting for you.
You defeated yourself based on the reality I constructed for you.
That is brilliant and insidious. So how does that apply to the digital terror of Daesh?
Daesh used reflexive control to hack the public opinion of Western nations. When they released those horrific, highly publicized execution videos, they knew they couldn't physically destroy the militaries of the US or France.
But by flooding the digital zone with spectacular cruelty, they provoked Western societies into states of deep paranoia.
This paranoia often manifested as intense, domestic anti-Muslim sentiment and fractured political discourse.
But when Western societies began turning on their own peaceful Muslim populations out of fear, they alienated those populations, validating Daesh's core narrative that the West was fundamentally at war with Islam.
Daesh manipulated Western societies into doing their radicalization work for them.
Which brings us to the final, most heavily debated, and perhaps most frightening concept in modern security, the lone wolf.
We have traced this from the massive state bureaucracy of the French Revolution to the tight-knit cells of the 19th century anarchists, to the organized armies of al-Qaeda, to this current moment where the threat has completely decentralized.
The lone wolf phenomenon is where the academic battleground is currently most heated, specifically in the debate between scholars Mark Sageman and Bruce Hoffman.
Sageman posits that the immersive nature of the digital age has created what he calls a leaderless jihad.
And it is worth noting from the sources that this concept of leaderless resistance wasn't actually invented by Islamic extremists.
It was pioneered in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups.
They used early primitive internet message boards to spread their ideology, encouraging individuals to commit acts of domestic terror without ever formally joining a group or communicating with a central leader, specifically to protect the leadership from FBI infiltration.
That is correct. The tactical architecture was established decades ago. But Sageman argues that Daesh perfected it on a global scale.
He argues that their transmedia digital propaganda is so immersive, so psychologically potent, that it serves as the organizational structure. The propaganda is the command.
Sageman believes this system can inspire individuals who have absolutely zero physical, financial, or logistical ties to Daesh to commit horrific violence in their name.
But Bruce Hoffman pushes back on this idea of the totally isolated actor incredibly hard.
He does. Hoffman argues that the concept of the pure lone wolf, an individual who simply wakes up one day, watches a YouTube video in total isolation, and flawlessly executes a complex mass casualty attack with zero prior connection to a broader network, is largely a myth.
Hoffman asserts that if intelligence agencies dig deep enough into the digital footprint of an attacker, there is almost always a tether.
There's usually someone on an encrypted messaging app who provided encouragement, transferred a small amount of cryptocurrency, or offered technical advice on building a weapon. They may be physically alone, but they are digitally networked.
Let's test these theories against a real-world case study from the sources. The devastating 2017 attacks in Barcelona.
Before the main attack on the Los Ramblas promenade, the terrorists had accidentally detonated their own bomb factory in a house in a town called Alcanar.
When investigators sifted through the rubble, they found the terrorists were manufacturing a highly unstable homemade explosive known as TATP.
Crucially, they discovered that the cell had learned how to synthesize these complex chemicals by following a recipe taken directly from an instructional video published by ISIS in 2016.
The video literally featured a militant standing in a kitchen in Syria, demonstrating how to mix the explosive precursors you can buy at a beauty supply store.
So these young men in Spain never traveled to Syria, they never met an ISIS commander, they received no funding.
But they downloaded the tactical knowledge and the ideological justification directly from the group's digital output. Doesn't that perfectly prove Sageman's point about remote inspiration creating a leaderless threat?
It absolutely bolsters Sageman's argument. They were radicalized and operationally educated entirely within the digital ecosystem Daesh provided, without needing a physical handler.
However, Hoffman would analyze the exact same case and point out that these individuals still operated as a localized cell. They were a group of brothers and friends collaborating, not a single, isolated lone wolf.
Furthermore, their ultimate goal was to pledge allegiance to the central brand of ISIS to validate their actions. So the psychological tether to the organization was completely intact, even if the logistical tether was not.
Okay, but I have to challenge this whole framework. I want to push back on what we're even defining here.
Go ahead.
If an individual, let's say a true lone actor, has zero physical contact with an organization, receives no weapons, no money, and simply downloads a hateful ideology and a cool cinematic aesthetic from a video online, and then commits an act of mass violence.
Are we even dealing with traditional terrorism anymore?
Or are we just looking at a deeply alienated, potentially mentally unstable individual committing a horrific mass murder, but wearing the political ideology like a Halloween costume to make their crime feel historically important?
That question, is it terrorism, or is it a violent crime in a political costume, is the multi-million-dollar dilemma for every modern counterterrorism agency on Earth.
Because how you define the problem dictates the medicine you prescribe.
If you determine that the attacker is primarily a disenfranchised, mentally unstable criminal wearing a costume, the solution lies in domestic policy. Better community mental health resources, robust social integration programs, and local community policing to identify individuals in crisis.
However, if you determine that this action, despite being committed by a single person, is an act of asymmetrical warfare inspired by a remote, leaderless network, the required solution is entirely different.
It demands sweeping intelligence gathering, mass digital surveillance, aggressive algorithmic censorship by tech companies, and potentially military strikes against the network's digital infrastructure abroad.
The profound danger, and we see this echo all the way back to the French in Algeria, is misdiagnosis.
If a state misdiagnoses a crisis of domestic alienation and mental health as a massive coordinated terrorist threat and applies the heavy hammer of military surveillance and civil rights restrictions, they risk alienating the very public they're trying to protect,
Potentially creating the radicalization they were trying to prevent. The cure, if misapplied, once again makes the disease worse.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of historical and psychological ground today. Let's briefly connect the dots of this journey to solidify what we've unpacked.
We started in the chaos of the French Revolution and the brutal efficiency of 20th century totalitarian regimes, where we saw that terror was originally a top-down, state-sponsored tool used to enforce order and crush dissent.
Then we watched the pendulum swing violently in the 19th century as anarchists like Carlo Tisacane introduced propaganda by the deed, transforming terror into a bottom-up tool for sub-state groups.
We saw how technology, like dynamite and timers, allowed Irish groups to pioneer global psychological warfare. We navigated the murky waters of decolonization and narco-terrorism, where the line between freedom fighter, cartel enforcer, and terrorist practically vanished.
And finally, we arrived at the modern digital era where the threat has decentralized from organized groups like Al-Qaeda into digitally inspired lone wolf actors utilizing transmedia narratives to hack the public consciousness.
Through all of this, from the guillotine in Paris to a timer bomb in London, to an execution broadcast on satellite TV, to an algorithmic video on a smartphone, the technology constantly mutated.
But the core objective remained terrifyingly consistent: the deliberate use of violence against instrumental victims to send a coercive psychological message to a wider audience.
It is a dark testament to human ingenuity. The medium of delivery has evolved from the public square to the palm of your hand, But the underlying psychological mechanism, the weaponization of fear to alter political reality, is identical.
And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
We've seen how terrorism is fundamentally tied to the cutting edge of communication technology. Every time a new medium emerges, the tactic adapts to exploit it perfectly. So looking forward, what happens next?
What happens to global security when artificial intelligence reaches the point where extremist networks no longer rely on broadcasting a single, one-size-fits-all propaganda video?
What happens when AI can analyze your specific internet search history, your social media likes, your deepest personal anxieties and political grievances, and instantly generate a personalized, psychologically tailored piece of digital propaganda by the deed designed exclusively to radicalize you?
How does a state counterterrorism unit or even a democratic society combat a threat that doesn't just broadcast fear but adapts perfectly in real time to the specific vulnerabilities of every single individual citizen on the internet?
When the drum Schmidt talked about isn't beating for a general audience, but is beating perfectly in tune with the algorithm inside your own personal echo chamber.
It is a profoundly sobering thought. It suggests that the battlefront of the future isn't a physical city or a transit system, but the customized digital reality each citizen inhabits.
Think back to our hook at the very beginning. In 1793, a terrorist was a virtuous defender of the state. Definitions flip. Technologies mutate. The only absolute constant in this centuries-long evolution is that the battle for the public's mind never stops.
Thank you for joining us on this massive historical deep dive. Keep questioning the definitions, stay curious about the world around you, and we will see you next time.